Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome from Singapore. And thank you for joining us on this event hosted by the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. Today, we'll be discussing a book entitled Rethinking Salafism, the Transnational Networks of Salafi Ulama. And of course, we've asked the author of the book today to discuss the pertinent issues related to the book. A bit about the book before we enter the discussion, and I'd like to discuss this rather extemporaneously, rather candidly. Of course, I do have some notes with me, but it would be good if we have a forthright discussion with our author today. And a bit more about a book that we are discussing today is that it was published last October by Oxford University Press. And the main, the gist of the book is about looking beyond existing literature, discussing transnational jihadi networks, where the book also discusses how quietist and activist Salafi clerics work across borders to preserve and promote what is deemed authentic Islam. I won't go too much into this because, of course, this will be the flesh of our discussion today, but I'll let our author express herself a bit more later. Now, moving on to a little bio introduction of our author today, who is Dr. Raihan Ismail. She is a senior lecturer at the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies at the Australian National University. She was a Discovery Early Career Fellow from 2019 to 2022, and she was also the co-recipient of the Max Crawford Medal in 2018, awarded by the Australian Academy of the Humanities. Besides the latest book, she's also the author of Saudi Clerics and Shia Islam, published by OUP as well in 2016. And of course, like I said, the book that we are discussing today was published last October. Dr. Ismail has also been the co-convener from 2015 to 2018 and convener 2019 to 2020 of the Political Islam Seminar Series for various Commonwealth government agencies, including the AGD and Defence. She's a regular commentator in the Australian and international media on Islam and Middle East politics, and she appeared as a panelist on the ABC's Q&A program. So a very warm welcome to Dr. Ismail today. So before we begin our discussion, I'd like to tell our audience that if you'd like to put in a question, please do so in the Zoom chat box, and then I can, of course, read them out to our speaker for today. So without further ado, let us enter into the thick of the discussion, the book. And let me put forward our first question to our speaker, which is, what prompted you to write this book, number one, and of course, what are the contributions that you think it will have to existing literature? So over to you, Raihan.
Thank you so much, Clemens. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to everyone for attending. I can see some familiar faces as well. So when I started this project, initially it was kind of based on my first book project, just part of my PhD. So the first book project, I looked at the attitudes of Saudi clerics towards the Shia. And while working on this project, I examined, what the Saudi clerics said about the Shia. But what's really interesting for me is understanding the categorization of Salafism. And that was discussed in my first book as well. How Salafi clerics in particular categorize or divided into three broad categories: quietist, activists, as well as jihadi clerics or jihadi groups. And what happened was that I've realized that in terms of the Shia, that categorization doesn't quite gel, doesn't really explain the attitudes of Saudi clerics and Salafi clerics in general. And some quietist clerics were vocal against the Shia, quite vitriolic against the Shia, and some activists were the same. And some activists were, particularly someone like Salman al-Auda from Saudi Arabia, was quite accommodating in his attitudes towards the Shia. So that's when I realized that maybe that categorization or that typology needs to be reassessed. And that's how I started the book project. I thought, okay, I'll have a look at the Salafi typology and perhaps reassess Salafi typology. And I know scholars have written extensively on Salafi typology and so on, but I thought, looking at that case study, particularly examining the Shia and the attitudes of Salafi clerics towards the Shia, I embarked on this project. So in terms of contributions, I think I can see a number of scholars who worked extensively on the subject as well. What I wanted to do, basically look at three things. The first thing is to examine the transnational networks of Salafi ulama or Salafi clerics. I use clerics and ulama interchangeably. And I think I'm quite liberal with the term ulama here. But I wanted to look at the networks of these clerics in three countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. And I've selected them for a reason. I know Saudi Arabia in particular, you have so many Salafi clerics who are very active, and Saudi Arabia is seen as the face of modern Salafism. In Kuwait, they're very active as well, despite the fact that it's a much smaller country. But having said that, Salafi clerics in Kuwait are very active internationally. And in Egypt, they're very popular. So Salafi clerics in Egypt, very popular, and that's why I've selected the three countries. So again, going back to contributions, again, that's a very good question. So the first one is to look at transnational networks of these clerics, to assess the origins, how they work together, to look at the collaboration and cooperation between these clerics. Second, I wanted to look at local circumstances of these ulama and whether or not local circumstances affect or destabilize the networks of clerics. And I think I've managed to discover a number of examples of how local circumstances affect or destabilize the networks of these clerics. And the third contribution perhaps is the reassessment of Salafi typology. And that is really going back to assessing Victor Wicks's categorization of Salafism, and therefore looking at various issues, including social liberalization, whether or not these ulama can be categorized or divided along quietist activist lines, particularly when addressing social issues. And according to my research, I don't think that reflects the attitudes of these clerics. I hope I've answered your question. I know I'm just looking at a number of issues here.
No, you have. I think you summarized it perfectly well, the 3 points that you made. But I wanted to go deeper into that point on typology and categorization, because that was something you dealt with in the book, and also specifically talking about the Shia issue, which you did devote an entire chapter to that. So at the beginning of your book, you divided these into three kind of groups, and you have the quietist / purist, you have the haraki / activist, and then you have the jihadi. So 3 groups. So if you could kindly outline to our audience, in a nutshell, what their attitudes generally consist of, and also how things have changed over the years. I probably not going too deep, because I guess there's a long history going into that, but perhaps you would be best to outline this first before we go deeper into specific events or issues. Yeah.
Yes. Again, scholars have written extensively on the typology, but in terms of understanding the 3 different categories, of course, you have the quietists, and within the quietist trend, you have sub-categories as well. So some would say that they are clerics who are radical quietists or described as radical quietists and so on. But generally, the quietists tend to support the state. They're apolitical, but some contest that idea as well. Of course, there's so many definitions. The debate is vibrant on the subject. But having said that, they're generally supportive of the state. And this is just a simple definition of that. And when you look at activists, Salafis, often they're very vocal, they discuss political issues. Some scholars argue that they're very similar to the Muslim Brotherhood in terms of their political activism, but when it comes to theology, when it comes to jurisprudence, they maintain and retain Salafi identity. But they don't advocate violence, for instance. Violent activism is something that, haraki or activist Salafis tend to avoid. And of course, the third is the jihadi Salafis, and we're talking about theoreticians, militants, and so on, who subscribe to Salafi ideals, but again advocate violence as a way of engaging with with politics and so on. And of course, in the book, I don't look at the third category. I feel that people have discussed the issue extensively. There's so many books on the jihadi networks and so on, and I felt that I wanted to focus on the first two trends within Salafism.
Thanks, Raihan. And so my first question, now that we've established kind of a base or foundation for the discussion, is really, about that whole transnational term that you used, at the center of your book title. And, somewhere along the way in your book, you mentioned that, the Hajj or the pilgrimage or such religious occasions and events could be a point of confluence for, personalities, clerics to meet and exchange ideas, and could be the birth of a movement, for example. And one of them, and I remember it well, is about Hassan al-Banna from Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Ibn Saud. And you talked a bit about, their meeting at the pilgrimage. So could you tell us a bit more about this and perhaps other examples where these kind of meetings, and what were the motivations? And usually when you have these leaders meeting at the pilgrimage, and whether or not this came to fruition, whether something concrete came out of these kind of meetings.
Yeah, of course. So I started particularly, looking at the origins and the nature of transnational networks of these clerics. And I've realized in my research that Rashid Rida perhaps was the person who actually fostered in the transnational connections with the Saudis, particularly the Najdi clerics before the establishment of the third Saudi state. And it's really interesting looking at Rashid Rida and his activities as well, his relations with Ibn Saud, the fact that most clerics, particularly those who subscribe to Salafi ideals in Egypt, were traveling back and forth from Egypt to Saudi Arabia. And I find that really interesting, particularly when studying periodicals, as well as Rashid Rida's magazine Al-Manar, for instance, looking at how he discussed Saudi Arabia, praised the Saudi religious establishment, praised Ibn Abdul Wahhab, praised his descendants, and so on. So you can see them developing these relations early on, particularly during Rida's time. And I would say that Rida, fostered great relations with Ibn Saud himself, and more importantly, the Saudi state was very receptive. The Saudi state embraced Rashid Rida and his clerics. So here you're looking at networks of clerics in which they fostered personal relations, but also professional relations. And I traced, which was really interesting for me, looking at these periodicals, managed to trace how even someone like Prince Ney, for instance, visited Egypt, and he pledged support to the Salafis in Egypt, basically arguing that the Salafis are Saudi Arabia's religious ambassadors, and had meetings with them and pledged financial support as well. So I thought it was really quite interesting looking at the early networks nurtured and developed through education, pilgrimage, and so on. When it comes to Hassan al-Banna, again, in terms of the Muslim Brotherhood, there are reports suggesting that Ibn Saud did meet with Hassan al-Banna, but was never really interested in Hassan al-Banna's political thought. And the Saudis in particular focus more on the Salafis in terms of fostering relations, because they felt that they're a lot closer to the Najdi traditions and so on. And this is where someone like Rashid Rida really played an important role in bringing the Saudis into the Salafi fold, because before this they were known as Wahhabis, derogatorily identified as Wahhabis. But Rashid Rida, in his articles and writings and so on, started to describe them as Salafis. and praised Ibn Saud as well as his ulama or his clerics. I hope I've answered your question, Clemens. But I think in terms of back and forth, religious education also played an important role. And maybe I can add a little bit more as well. Salafi clerics in Egypt not only traveled to Saudi Arabia, they were cooperating with the Saudi clerics, but more importantly, they began to occupy important positions in Saudi Arabia. And I felt that was really interesting. Not the Muslim Brotherhood, despite the fact that the Saudi ruling family tried to foster relations and allowed Saudis, members of the Muslim Brotherhood to travel to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia and establish themselves there, particularly again when they were fighting against Gamal Abdel Nasser. But important positions, only Egyptian Salafi clerics were occupied important positions. And I would argue because of the theological closeness to the Najdi traditions and so on. So someone like Abdul Razak al-Afifi and other clerics, they occupied important positions in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, thanks. And taking, singling out a point about, this transnational connection going back and forth, the clerics going, in and out of their borders. And also, this is where, local circumstances or the domestic, dynamics come into play, because, obviously the two countries will have different kinds of environment or room for these clerics to, I guess, to expand themselves. So how, could you give some examples of how these acted as either constraints or, a way of, expanding or expansion?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Clemens. In terms of the Salafis in Egypt, they've always practiced political quietism and supported the Saudi state, the Egyptian state, despite the fact that they fostered good relations with Saudi Arabia, always supported the Egyptian state. Groups such as Ansar al-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya, an Egyptian Salafi association, would often praise Gamal Abdel Nasser. So the Suez Canal, for example, they would write articles and send letters to Gamal Abdel Nasser and praise Gamal Abdel Nasser's bravery and commitment to protecting Egypt and so on. And that's always been, the attitudes of Salafi clerics in Egypt. But having said that, it was post-Mubarak time that you started to witness Salafi clerics in Egypt changing their attitudes. And for a very long time, they've maintained that, political quietism, it was working for them. The Muslim Brotherhood occupied the political space in Egypt. So political Islam was very much dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Salafis in Egypt were quite happy. Like, yeah, that's all right. We're quite happy to talk about, authentic Islam and so on. And they maintained relations with Saudi Salafis, but tried not to comment on politics. Even when they commented on politics, they're very supportive of their state, and they're also very supportive of the Saudi state. And that is because they wanted to maintain quietism. Maybe I'll give one example of them supporting the Saudi state is that when the first Gulf War happened, and activist clerics in Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia started to question the Saudi state for allowing US troops to be based on Saudi soil. And here you're looking at the crystallization of the haraki movement within Salafism as well. The Egyptian Salafis maintained quietism, but also wrote an article in support of the Saudi state, saying that it's outrageous what these people are doing. That demonstrated that transnational networks and their support for their co-religionists in Saudi Arabia. They supported the Grand Mufti's fatwa, for instance, the Saudi Grand Mufti's fatwa, Ibn Baz's fatwa. And they're in Egypt, but they're like, no, we're maintaining our political quietism, and it's transnational, the way we foster these ideals. But things, again, political circumstances change. And post-Mubarak's time, that's when some of the quietists decided that maybe there's room for us to participate in politics. Maybe there's room for us to actually demonstrate that we are also interested in power. So a number of clerics, for example, started to talk about political activism. They started to criticize the Muslim Brotherhood, but some criticize Mubarak's regime and so on. And one cleric in particular, Ishaq al-Huwaini, used to be praised as a true quietist, truly knowledgeable, a true quietist, committed to the quietist ideal and authentic Salafism. But in post-Mubarak time, he fostered relations with a number of clerics, particularly the activist clerics. So again, some would argue it is the changing circumstances that compelled him to change his attitudes as well towards political activism. So I've kind of dealt with a number of examples as well, trying to understand how these clerics change their attitudes, how they behave as well, and perhaps even express the limits of transnationalism. So many would argue that transnational networks fosters collective solidarity and so on. But when it comes to local circumstances, you do have to be a bit careful as well. So maybe now I'm getting excited with the examples, Clement. More recently, in 2019, one of the prominent clerics or activist clerics in Saudi Arabia by the name of A'id al-Qarni used to be one of the really prominent in promoting activism and so on. And some argue, or at least I'm arguing, that the rise of Mohammed bin Salman, the changing political environment in Saudi Arabia made it very difficult for activist clerics to operate. And in 2019, he came out in support of the state and praised Mohammed bin Salman and denounced activism, particularly the Sahwa movement. Of course, that caused a lot of uproar in various parts of the Muslim world. And I would say the Kuwaiti cleric Hakim al-Mutayri, for instance, criticized him on Twitter and said, "What's happening? I'm so disappointed in him." I think that's one of the things that he said. But here, limits of transnationalism, again, they used to be good friends. A'id al-Qarni even wrote an endorsement of Hakim al-Mutayri's book, for instance. So again, I'm demonstrating that how local circumstances can destabilize transnational networks of clerics.
Yep. And these are the kinds of events that could, cause an evolution to appear in terms of the stance or attitudes of the clerics. But there are also events with regional implications, and I think you talked a bit about Mubarak, but then there was the Arab Spring, and then after that you have Sisi coming in, and then you also have, I'm stretching it a bit, you have the Qatar blockade as well that came out. So, could you just pick out, some instances in this development of trajectory or the shifting stances of the clerics based on these kind of regional events that happened during 11 and then 2011, 2017? Were there shifting attitudes in that sense among the quietists, among the hierarchies?
Yeah, I would say in terms of post-Arab uprisings, quietist clerics were quiet. I think they were quite nervous and they were monitoring the situation in the region. And despite the fact that people were celebrating, post-Mubarak, celebrating the Arab uprisings in certain countries, not in other countries, of course, the Salafis would never acknowledge it in Bahrain. But in celebrating the gains made by the revolutionaries, for example, the quietists were reluctant to comment on issues. The activists, on the other hand, were vocal. They were ecstatic. They were so excited about the development. They praised the revolutionaries and so on. And that lasted for a few years because of the development that happened afterwards with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power and so on. That actually really galvanized the haraki networks and activated the haraki networks. But having said that, post-2013, particularly with the fall of the Muslim Brotherhood government, the rise of ISIS, Islamism suffering brand damage as well, really affected the activist fortunes or political fortunes in the region. And what I've witnessed is a shift from activists being vocal, because many of them were arrested as well, the quietists then took over. And they started to question activism, started to question revolution, started to question a few things that happened during the Arab uprisings and post-Arab uprising. So what I've discovered is that quietist clerics in Egypt, in Kuwait, and I know, a big fan of Zoltan's work as well in terms of Salafism in Kuwait. And I know he appeared with Salim al-Tawil, so a prominent Salafi cleric in Kuwait who's a quietist. These are the clerics who are quite dominant in their rhetoric at the moment. They're the ones who are discussing issues and supporting states in the region. So the quietists kind of took over in many ways. And activists are operating in obscurity, in exile, some are in prison and so on. So I think there's definitely a shift in terms of promoting activism and dealing with the political circumstances in the region.
Yeah. And earlier on, you also mentioned in passing about the Saudi Arabia, the kingdom under Mohammed bin Salman, who's acting like de facto leader at the minute. And of course, he has reined in pretty much the clerics, and he has his vision 2030. And we did briefly discuss this with Stefan Lacroix several months ago. And what's your take on this move by the Crown Prince, and and if you have encountered in your findings again shifting attitudes? How you mentioned there's harakis, there's quietists. How are they reacting or responding to the policies by the Crown Prince?
Oh, it's a very good question, Clemens. I think in terms of supporting MBS and Vision 2030, it seems that the clerics in Saudi Arabia have very little choice. Those who even briefly question the Saudi ruling family, they've been arrested in jail, and there are reports of torture and so on. Someone like Salman al-Auda or Awad al-Qarni, they're in prison at the moment. And therefore, you're looking at a different environment in Saudi Arabia, because before MBS, clerics had the opportunity, of course, limited opportunities, but still had the opportunity to question the state. But I think it's very difficult at the moment. And even quietist clerics have also been targeted by the Saudi ruling family. Some who refuse to endorse social liberalization efforts propagated by the state have also been targeted by members of the ruling family. What's interesting for me is that looking at some clerics who now they're just supporting the state, even though they were activists originally. Someone like Muhammad al-Arifi, who's known, I like saying this, but he's known as the Brad Pitt of Sheikhdom. People comment on how good looking he is. I'm not sure about that, but having said that, he used to be one of the activist clerics, but came out in support of the state, in support of MBS, in support of Saudi Arabia's boycott of Qatar, for instance. And I wrote about him in the book and saying that perhaps he's a bit, he does change his opinions occasionally, but there are reports which I have not really mentioned in the book, that he is under house arrest. He's been targeted by state security apparatus, and he's not allowed to travel and leave the country, for instance. So even activist clerics who used to be very vocal are now careful, and those who are not careful are in prison. And I think in terms of demonstrating support for the state, you have to be vocal. You can't just say, I'm going to not say anything, I'm going to be quiet and not talk about politics. I think even that is not an option. So you have to demonstrate vocal support for the state. And that's what I would say when it comes to efforts. But there are many supporters. I think MBS has many supporters within the religious establishment as well.
Yeah, if I may take this question further, and then before that, I'd like to encourage our audience, members of the audience, to put in your questions in the chat box, while I put forward another question on the kingdom, which is, based on what you just said, there seems to also be a promotion of moderate Islam under the Crown Prince, and you address this in your book under one section titled are Wahhabis also Salafis? And I think there was this section there. And you mentioned earlier about Rashid Rida trying to bring the Wahhabis under the Salafi fold. And so my question is, how does this tie in with Saudi Arabia's current promotion of moderate Islam and its past dealings with Wahhabism? Because the Crown Prince himself, in an interview last May, he said, he declared this aspect of the kingdom as out of date. So what are your thoughts on all these?
Yeah, fascinating development, I would say, in terms of the Crown Prince kind of moving away from Wahhabi ideals. And of course, we've had this discussion earlier that Rashid Rida really wanted to make sure that the Wahhabis are identified as Salafis, and therefore they're part of the Sunni movement in general, because the Wahhabis were considered as an extremist tribal sect before. But obviously that changed, particularly in the 1970s. Salafi books were changed from Wahhabis to Salafis. They've used more Salafism or Salafiyya rather than al-Wahhabiyya. I don't think Mohammed ibn Salman really shows commitment to Wahhabi ideals, through his promotion of moderate Islam. And I think in many ways that is a shift, at least that's my reading, that is a shift from staying true to the pact made between Ibn Abdul Wahhab and Muhammad ibn Saud to something completely different. So reconstructing Saudi identity in many ways as well. So we're focusing on moderate Islam, we're looking at social liberalization, we're moving away from extremism. And it seems that the idea that your national identity or religious identity is no longer as significant. It's important, but not within the framework of Wahhabi ideals. And I think has been quite successful, successfully propagated by Mohammed ibn Salman. There are also clerics who are very supportive of that project. I would say someone like Hatim al-Auni, and I've discussed Hatim al-Auni extensively in the book, where he is a reformist, a Salafi Wahhabi reformist. So he's arguing that, yes, we respect Ibn Abdul Wahhab, we respect the Najdi tradition, we respect the descendants of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, but they've made mistakes. And we have to acknowledge that they've made mistakes as well in some areas. And therefore, it is okay for you to move away from some of the writings or rulings of Ibn Abdul Wahhab and the Najdi tradition. So here you're looking at post-Salafism, as some scholars have argued, where some clerics in Saudi Arabia do support that project. So I think, despite the fact that there are those who are very critical of Muhammad ibn Salman, there are members, Ulama within the religious tradition that would endorse what he's doing as well. And some would say it's about time that you move away from Wahhabi tradition.
Yeah, and you talked about it's about time, and I think here it's probably apt to mention Iran in the picture, because you wrote about Iran as the Iranian Revolution first as an event that changed quietist elements in Egypt, but not in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. And the recent events, of course, have shown that they are both talking. The kingdom and Iran are both talking. So what dribbles down to the ground in terms of the clerics? What's the take now on the ground, and how has this evolved since 1979, and also after the passing of Ayatollah Khomeini, for example, later on? How has this attitudes changed over the years?
Of course, it's a great question. It's not going to be an easy one to answer. I think in terms of Iran post 1979, the ulama, particularly Salafi ulama, not just in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait and Egypt, they have been vocal against Iran and did not recognize the legitimacy of the Iranian revolution as an Islamic revolution. And that's pretty consistent in terms of their rhetoric and so on. And until recently, Salafi ulama, whom I've discussed in the book, don't tend to accept the legitimacy of Iran, but are very critical of Iran's political activities in the region, the thought that they're exporting the Iranian Revolution, or they're destabilizing Iraq, or destabilizing Yemen, for instance, their support for the Houthis, their support for Hezbollah, support for Bashar al-Assad, are highlighted by, is highlighted by these clerics. When it comes to the Shia, I would say Salafi clerics are divided into two categories. At least that's my reading. You have those who advocate a traditionalist view, and the traditionalist view would argue that there are issues with Salafi theology, not Shia theology. There are various sects within Shiism, but largely they're deviant, removed from Islam, particularly the more extreme sects within the Shia. And their understanding is that Iran is divisive. Iran is a subversive force, a destabilizing force, and it's very difficult to see them accepting Iran as a positive force in the region. That fear of Iran is widely circulated, widely held, or widely believed by these clerics. Then you have the moderate, or not the progressive ulama, I would say. And it's very tricky for them because Salafi theology really criticizes the Shia. It's very difficult for Salafis to accept the legitimacy of the Shia. And that's because of the nature of Salafi ideals, the issue of the oneness of God, and so on. Shia practices are seen as deviant. So it's so difficult for them to accept the legitimacy of various Shia sects for that matter. But the difference lies in the rhetoric and the frequency of rhetoric of these clerics. These clerics, particularly those who I would claim as progressive, are quite careful when discussing the Shia. They're very critical of Iran, but they're very careful when discussing the Shia in Kuwait. They're more careful when addressing the Shia in Saudi Arabia. They're more careful when addressing the Shia in Iraq, for instance. And they deal with Shiism as a political issue rather than a theological issue, because they just don't want to go there. And it seems that it will say, yeah, some Shia are acceptable, some are not, but let's not focus on that. Let's talk about their political activities. And Shia in Kuwait are citizens like us. We have to be very careful, very respectful. But Iran is a problem. So I don't think the attitudes towards Iran have changed, but I do think that you do have the progressive Salafi clerics who try to embrace the Shia in various countries, particularly if they're in Arab countries, for instance. So that's how I would look at it. At least, that's how I discuss the issue in the book. But what's interesting is that in Egypt, the Salafi clerics in Egypt, quietists, activists, all of them, from my understanding, have been so vocal against the Shia. And this is despite the fact that you have only 100,000 Shia in Egypt, a country of almost 90 million people. And it's puzzling that they're more vocal, they're more vitriolic when it comes to the Shia. And perhaps I would, argue that they don't have to deal with the Shia very much. The Shia are treated as a deviant, mysterious entity, as a sect, and they are always very suspicious of the Shia, and they don't see them, they don't engage with them, they don't see Shia politicians and so on, unlike Kuwait, for instance, or Shia leaders in Saudi Arabia. So I would say in Egypt, it's very different.
Thanks, Raihan. I want to come back to that because this is where it gets interesting and you reassess that typology, in terms of the clerical attitudes towards the Shia. But we'll come back to that. We have a question from the floor from Matthew Gray. Matthew, thank you. And he says, great presentation, Raihan, many thanks. One question that occurred to me is that you don't spend a lot of time in the book on Salafi views vis-a-vis democracy and parliamentarism, apart from some discussion on Tawhid al-Hakimiyya as a concept. Mm-hmm. So could you talk a little more about how various Salafis have discussed democracy and parliaments in practice in recent times? For example, how they view Kuwaiti parliamentarism and how they engage in and responded to the electoral politics in Egypt.
Mm. Great. Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you for coming, Matthew. Matthew is a mentor, so I'm really so excited to see him. So in terms of, yes, you're absolutely right. I haven't really discussed that very much in the book. But I think in terms of Salafi attitudes towards democracy, for instance, activist clerics in particular view, in Egypt, I would say, view democracy as a problem. It's a Western construct, it's a Western concept. And in many ways, if we practice democracy, it will be a Western imposition on Muslim societies. But having said that, in post-Mubarak era, they haven't really accepted democracy, but what they've done is argue that, yes, we have to participate in order for us to come to power. Eventually, that's going to have to be the case. So not accepting it as a legitimate political process, but arguing that that's the system, we have to participate in the system, but that doesn't mean that we accept the legitimacy of democracy because of the oneness of God and so on. But it is a way to actually change the plight of your society. It is a way to maintain Islamic principles and Islamize Egyptian society. So I think you have that as well. In the context of Kuwait, for instance, I think Zoltan is here. Sorry, I keep looking, addressing you, Zoltan, but I think you've written extensively on the subject as well, particularly looking at Kuwaiti parliamentarians and so on. And you have ISA, for instance, it's a group that promotes political quietism, but realizing that coming to power is important. Not coming to power, participating in elections, participating in the political system is important. You have to support the state, the ruling family, but it's important in order for you to promote Islamic principles and so on. So it's more like a hybrid quietist activist group. So they deal with the issue of democracy, which I haven't really dealt in the book, but they talk about it when they ask questions, when they engage with the religious rulings and so on. The general attitude is not very positive, but it is seen as a necessity, particularly if you want to implement changes within your society. I hope I've answered your question, Matthew.
Thanks, Raihan. And so thanks again, Matthew, for the question. I want to come back to your earlier comments on Iran and attitudes towards the Shia community. And of course, in Saudi Arabia, there have been instances of trying of, I would say, reconciliation, and these are often initiated by the king. For example, King Abdullah, he had a national dialogue when he was in power, and he sought to improve the relations with the Shia communities. And under such circumstances, what is the feeling on the ground from the Salafi clerics? And that's part one of my question. Part two of my question goes back to Iran, and in what ways did the revolution instill collective solidarity, among these Salafi clerics? Because you use the term collective solidarity, and that portion of your book comes after you say that there's an entrenchment in the divide between quietists and haraki. So, and then subsequently you say there's a collective solidarity towards, in this case. So how did your line of thought come about in this sense? So I wanted to hear more from you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I think when it comes to Iran, the Salafi ulama are generally very suspicious of Iran. Even after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, unlike the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, members of the Muslim Brotherhood also celebrated the gains made by the revolutionaries, did not really criticize Iran. They thought it was great. Of course, they had issues with Iran later. But the Muslim Brotherhood was generally receptive of the Iranian Revolution. But for the Salafis, it's very difficult to see them accepting Iran as a positive force in the region, or at least try and repair relations with Iran. They've always been very suspicious of Iran, and it's very much like the Saudi ruling family as well, very suspicious of Iran and Iranian activities in the region. So in terms of Salafi clerics, as you've mentioned, the idea of collective solidarity, here I argue that through publications, through sermons, through lectures and so on, religious rulings. The Saudi ulama, Salafi ulama in Kuwait, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia endorse each other's work, republish each other's works, comment on each other's works as well, saying that read this cleric's work, for instance, he talks about the Salafi, talks about Iranian influence and so on. So I think when it comes to Iran, you do see that collective solidarity in combating Iranian influence in the region, or reminding others of Iranian treachery and so on. That's the kind of language that they use. What I would say is the progressive clerics, even when they criticize Iran, they're very different from others because they don't use the term Rafida, for instance, the rejectors. That is seen as a derogatory identification of the Shia. So these clerics are a bit more careful. Someone like Salman al-Auda is more careful. Very rarely that you hear him use the term Shia. And when he discusses Iran, he will look at Iran within the framework of politics rather than theology, rather than religion, because he didn't want to offend the Shia in Saudi Arabia, tried to be careful with the Shia in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and other parts of the world as well. So here, the progressive, again, in terms of what they talk about, they're more careful. But when you press them hard, and some tribe, that's when you see the Salafi thinking coming out. That's when they say, yes, if you identify a deviant Shia who engages in deviant practices, you cannot reply to his salam, for instance. You cannot eat their slaughtered meat, for instance. So I think even the progressive ones, when you press them hard, they really can't deviate from original Salafi thinking when it comes to the Shia. As you were saying earlier, Clemens, I think in terms of responding to the state, and especially when the state promotes reconciliation efforts, King Abdullah himself, or the former king, promoted reconciliation efforts, his national dialogue when he was a crown prince, in which he promoted collaboration with the Shia, or at least tried to repair relations with the Shia. Some Salafi ulama, particularly the progressive ulama, really embarked on that project. And I think because they genuinely believe that it's important for you to work with the Shia in order for you to create a harmonious society, a harmonious Saudi Arabia. And if you want to avoid Iranian influence and Iran being able to destabilize the kingdom, it's important for you to pacify your own citizens. So that's why they embrace that project. And I think generally because they really do promote reconciliation, but there are not many of them, at least in the 90s and so on.
Thanks, Raihan, for answering my questions. I'm going to put my own questions on hold now because we do have some from the floor. And I think you mentioned his name one too many times, Zoltan. So Zoltan has a question for you, and it just came in. So his question is, can you outline a bit more about your methodology? And have you managed to interview the Salafi sheikhs that you mentioned in your book? As far as I understand, you consider the quietist/activist dichotomy more driven by local socio-political circumstances than by ideology, unlike wage makers, for example. Mm-hmm. This brings him to the conclusion that you have to set up a new typology with the start of every Salafism-related project. So that is his question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, a very good question. I know your work, very familiar with your work. You've interviewed Salafi clerics and so on. I haven't, unfortunately. I think I initially wanted to go to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and then the pandemic hit, and it was just almost impossible for me to travel. But also, I think there were limitations on my part in terms of being able to interview them. What I've done in terms of my methodology is rely on periodicals. I've also relied on their sermons, lectures, and religious rulings, for instance. And I think that's definitely an issue on my part because I've always wanted to be able to interview them, but I wasn't really sure if that was going to work or not. But something that I've also done is kind of send them questions. And asking them to respond to my questions because they are often very active They have Twitter accounts, they have their websites. Hakim al-Mutayri, for example, has his own site where you can ask questions, and then he will respond to your questions and so on. So, short answer, no, I haven't really interviewed these clerics. In terms of the typology, I do agree that ideology and theology plays an important role, but what I've realized is also these clerics, at least from my understanding and my conclusion, is that they're very much influenced by their circumstances as well. Their exposure to issues, for instance, would kind of compel them to reassess their position. In Egypt, for instance, a number of ulama in Egypt, because of their relations with Christian communities and the fact that they have to make sure and maintain relations with the Coptic communities in Egypt, they're very careful when addressing the Coptic communities in Egypt. And here, as you've said, I do introduce different typologies when it comes to addressing different issues. And that's why the book, is titled Rethinking Salafism, because of that domestic circumstances, but more importantly, how these clerics often reassess how they also change their attitudes towards issues. When it comes to social liberalization and social conservatism, I argue that the ulama can be divided into two categories, and that is progressive and traditionalist. And here, the traditionalist ulama on the issue of women, on the issue of relations with Copts, relations with Christians, and so on, you do have Salafi ulama who reassess their positions and they take a more liberal approach to issues. Music, the beard, and so on. They do take a different approach. The niqab, again, some of them take a different approach. And they argue that maybe we need to move away from traditional Salafi thinking and reassess Salafi literature. And you do have ulama who advocate for reform within Salafism. Hatim al-Auni is one of them. Usama al-Qusi not Usama al-Qusi, sorry. Oh dear, I can't remember the name. Sorry, in Egypt, a number of them are in Egypt as well, but they're not many of them. So again, very minorities within Salafism. Adil al-Kalbani is another alim as well, who would say that women should be allowed to drive, and taking a different approach, different interpretations. So I would argue that yes, you do have that collective solidarity, or transnational interpretations are advocated by these clerics, but at the same time, they're also governed by their local circumstances, as well as their own reassessment of Salafi thinking and Salafi thought, and so on. I hope I've answered your question.
Thanks, Raihan, and then thanks for your question, Zoltan. We've got another question from my colleague Asif Shuja, who's a senior research fellow here with us today. And his question is, what troubles Islam? What ails Islam? How have you attempted to tackle this question in your book, and what can scholars do to alleviate that? And perhaps I could add a bit more to his question is, you talked a lot about ijtihad and how different scholars, different clerics exercise independent reasoning, early in your book. And have you encountered that, any discrepancies in terms of how this is received from the ummah? This is number one. And number two, the embrace of modern technology, which you also described in your book as there was some resistance to that. And until, the early 2000s, you talk about satellite television, you talked about the internet. What about now? How is this embrace of technology being received now by the clerics, and also how is received on the followers' part? What do we see in terms of trends now? So over to you.
No, of course. Again, excellent question. Thank you so much, Asif, for that question. So I'll answer the question, embracing technology and what does it mean for Salafi adherents as well as the ulama. And the Salafis always believe that deviation or innovation is a problem. You can't really, promote innovation, for example. And according to Salafis, let me just have a look. There is a slide that I have here that I was going to share with everyone. Yeah, every novelty, I'm just going to read it out loud. Every novelty says a prophet's tradition. I'm just translating it. Every novelty is an innovation. Every innovation is a misguidance, and every misguidance belongs to hellfire. And you hear this a lot in Salafi sermons, in religious rulings, for instance, when they're answering questions and so on. But what I've discovered as well, it depends on how you define innovation. And here, the Saudi religious establishment in particular, and this ruling is used by other Salafis as well when addressing something such as technology. They would argue that, technology is fine. It's only religious innovation that we have a problem with. So social media, that's all right. Most of them have Twitter accounts anyway. They have their own official YouTube account. And I think this has been the case for a very long time, particularly members of the Saudi religious establishment. Ibn Saud himself, Abdul Aziz Ibn Saud himself, initially introduced the radio, and the ulama were horrified because they thought this is, terrible innovation, and we're moving away from our religious tradition. But he played the Quran. And invited all the clerics to come and listen to the Quran. And therefore, many argued that, oh yeah, that's actually not a bad thing. So we can listen to the Quran. So he himself was very clever when engaging with the ulama. And I think that position persisted in terms of accepting innovation, but not religious innovation. So the way you pray, the Shia, for example, Sufi traditions and so on, are considered as religious innovation. So they have an issue with religious innovation, but not, technology or other form of innovation. So I hope I've answered that question. And I think that persisted in terms of understanding and so on the part of the Salafi ulama, and they advocate that quite widely.
Thanks, Raihan. We got another question from Thomas Frank Marie Chauvenier. Hope I got your Chevrier, sorry. His question is, you mentioned music and changes in attitudes towards music. Are you saying that they would accept, I guess the clerics would accept styles such as mahragan in Egypt, or the street music? Yeah, that was the question.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Thomas. I would say that they will not accept that because it's considered as not an Islamic practice for sure, because music has always been very divisive within the Salafi tradition, even within the Muslim Brotherhood tradition, even within Al-Azhar's tradition as well. We have clerics who are more conservative and ulama who are more conservative and have had issues with music. But there are progressive voices even within the Salafi tradition. And I would say they talk about musical instruments. And someone like Hatim al-Auni, Adil al-Kalbani, they would argue that in some music is acceptable, that is fine, because you have to look at the Prophet's tradition. The Prophet never really prohibited music or listening to music. So they're very careful, and they have, I would use this word, they have copped a lot of abuse from other Salafi clerics because they're saying, what are you trying to invent Salafism? So these minority voices have challenged Salafi position towards music, but again, the minority voices. Someone in Egypt, I keep forgetting his name, but one of the Salafi ulama in Egypt even said that, you can listen to Kulthum. How can you not listen to Kulthum or Abdul Halim Hafiz? And he's a Salafi alim. So again, taking a different position. But someone like him is far removed from Salafi ideals, despite the fact that he claims to be a strong Salafi, for instance. So you do have minority voices, but very small number of ulama who would say that music is permissible, but something like mahragan would be too radical for them to accept. I hope I've answered your question, Thomas.
Thanks, Raihan, and thanks, Thomas, for your question. In a blink of an eye, we are coming to a close to the session. It's almost an hour. But I would like to ask one final question to our speaker for today, and that has to do with our region, Southeast Asia. And we venture a bit further out from your book, and I would like to know, in your findings, have you come across, the connections between the Middle East and Asia in terms of the Salafi ulama that you're talking about, and that you wrote about, and what can you say in general about the influence that has been from one region to another? So over to you.
Thank you so much, Clemens. That's a very good question, and I will be demonstrating my ignorance if I try and answer this question too much. And I know Zoltan has written a lot on Salafism in Cambodia, and I thought that's really fascinating in terms of the Salafi influence in Cambodia. I haven't really looked at Salafism in Southeast Asia for sure, but I've also noticed there's some activities in Indonesia, particularly with Kuwaiti Salafis. Sometimes when I'm looking at Islam in Indonesia, we'll find that Salafi clerics in Indonesia have been, traveling to Indonesia and also working with Salafis in Indonesia. So you see a bit of that as well. What's interesting in the context of Malaysia, I'm half Malaysian, so and I do have some friends who've traveled to Saudi Arabia and kind of brought back that Salafi ideology to Malaysia as well. And many of them, they went to Islamic University of Medina, received scholarship from the Saudi government. So you do have that link with Malaysia as well, particularly the state, the most northern state of Malaysia, state of Perlis. So it's very much, it's kind of almost a talk and a discussion in Malaysia that's Perlis is very much a Salafi state. To what extent that is true? Of course, it's debatable, and many of them also have to respond to local circumstances. They can't come back to Perlis or come back to Malaysia and claim to be a Salafi. It's not that popular in Malaysia. So of course, you do have resistance as well. But in terms of the interpretations of Islam, some would argue that they're influenced by their religious training in Saudi Arabia. So, a bit here and there, but as I've said earlier, I'll be demonstrating my ignorance big time if I talk about it too much.
Well, Raihan, thank you so much for joining us today and answering all the questions. I think it was an excellent discussion. And also thank you to the audience for putting in your questions. I think we covered a great deal of ground. So Raihan, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to Sharon for organizing this and setting up the Zoom. And to the audience, we hope to see you more on our events. Raihan, thank you for taking time.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks and goodbye. Thanks, Raihan.
Thanks.